She had survived 3 recessions, 2 toxic bosses, and 1 catastrophic breakup that left her eating cereal for dinner for 6 months straight. Claire Whitmore thought she had seen everything New York City could throw at a woman trying to claw her way up from nothing. But nothing had prepared her for the moment the most dangerous man in Manhattan looked up from his desk, locked eyes with her, and asked in a voice as calm as a funeral, "Why can't you stop gazing at the bulge in my pants?" And just like that, her whole world stopped. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The elevator smelled like leather and money. Not the kind of money that came with coupons and layaway plans. The quiet, suffocating kind that didn't announce itself because it didn't have to. Claire Whitmore stood with her spine straight and her leather portfolio pressed flat against her ribs like a shield, watching the floor numbers climb. 38, 39, 40. She hadn't eaten since 5 that morning. Her left heel had been rubbing a blister since Lexington Avenue. She could feel the thin skin tearing with every shift of her weight, and she refused to let it show on her face. She had too much riding on the next 4 hours to limp. The Bellucci Group occupied the top 3 floors of the Meridian Tower on 57th Street, one of those glass and steel columns that caught the light at a certain hour and turned the whole Manhattan sky amber. From the outside, it looked architectural, aspirational. Inside, it breathed differently, controlled, pressurized, like the air itself had signed an NDA. Claire had done her research. She'd spent 3 weeks doing her research. Lorenzo Bellucci, 41 years old, born in Palermo, educated at Bocconi in Milan and then Columbia, built the American branch of the Bellucci Group from a mid-size import firm into a holding company that now touched logistics, commercial real estate, private equity, and what their annual report vaguely described as international commodities facilitation. He had been profiled twice in Forbes, once in The Economist, and never, not once, in the Post gossip section, which in New York was either a sign of extraordinary discipline or extraordinary legal counsel. Probably both. His previous personal secretary, a woman named Helen Carver, had lasted 11 months before leaving quietly for a position at a competing firm. Before Helen, Marcus Webb had held the role for 7 months. Before Marcus, a woman whose name Claire had never been able to find in any public record whatsoever, which bothered her more than she admitted. The agency that placed her had been unusually specific during the briefing. Punctuality is not optional. It is a condition of employment. The woman at the agency, narrow shoulders, reading glasses on a chain, voice like a recorded message, had said it without blinking. Mr. Bellucci expects documentation to be prepared before he asks for it. He expects problems to be solved before he identifies them. He does not repeat instructions. He does not negotiate timelines. He does not accept excuses regardless of their validity. Are we clear? Claire had nodded. She'd been nodding at people like that her whole life. Nod, absorb, perform. The elevator opened onto a reception area done entirely in pale marble and charcoal wood. A young man in a slim-cut suit stood waiting with the kind of practiced neutrality that took years to perfect. He introduced himself as Daniel, said nothing about her being 4 minutes early, which Claire took as a neutral sign, and walked her to a waiting area beside a floor-to-ceiling window that looked directly south across Central Park. She sat down and crossed her ankles and did not look at the park. She looked at the door across the room instead. It was a single door, dark walnut, no visible handle from this distance. Beside it stood a second man, older, wider, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to stand in one place for very long periods of time. His jacket fit poorly across the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with the tailor. Claire had grown up in Bensonhurst. She recognized a shoulder holster under a jacket. She filed that away and said nothing. 12 minutes later, Daniel reappeared, told her Mr. Bellucci was ready, and opened the walnut door. The office was enormous without trying to be. No art on the walls except for one large topographic map of southern Italy behind the desk, marked with small, handwritten annotations she couldn't read from the doorway. The desk itself was clean. 2 monitors, 1 legal pad, a pen, a half-empty glass of water. 1 chair on his side, 2 on hers. Nothing else. Lorenzo Bellucci was standing at the window when she entered, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. He was taller than the photograph suggested. The suit was charcoal, beautifully constructed, and he wore it the way certain men wore clothes. Not as something put on, but as something that had simply arranged itself around them. He didn't turn around immediately. Claire stood in front of the desk and waited. She did not fidget. She did not look around the room again. She looked at the middle of his back and breathed at a normal rate and waited. 30 seconds passed. He turned. His face was what the photographs had not fully captured. Angular, sharp through the jaw, with dark eyes that moved across her in a single pass and then settled. Not the kind of look that lingered, the kind that took everything it needed in one efficient sweep and was done. "Sit down," he said. His accent was faint, layered, Italian beneath the American like a watermark. She sat. He came to his desk but didn't sit. He stood behind it with both hands resting on the edge and looked at the portfolio she had placed on her knee. "You were at Hargrove Capital for 3 years." "Yes." "You left." "I did." "Why?" It wasn't a question the way he said it. Claire had prepared for this. "My direct supervisor took credit for a compliance restructure I designed from the ground up. When I brought it to HR, I was told the company preferred to resolve internal matters quietly. I concluded the company's preference for quiet was not compatible with my preference for accuracy." A beat of silence. "You could have stayed and been angry about it." "I could have," she said. "That seemed like a waste of time." He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he pulled back the chair and sat down. The interview lasted 40 minutes. He didn't ask about her strengths or her weaknesses or where she saw herself in 5 years. He gave her 3 scenarios. A scheduling conflict involving 2 board members who refused to be in the same room, a document discrepancy in a quarterly audit that needed to disappear without technically disappearing, and a situation involving a foreign government official and a missed wire transfer, and asked her how she would handle each. Claire answered plainly, without hedging. He didn't react to any of her answers. He just moved to the next one. At the end, he stood and said, "You start Monday." That was it. No salary discussion, no benefits overview. Daniel handled all of that in a separate room with a folder that had already been prepared, which meant the decision had been made before she walked in, which meant the interview had been something else entirely. A confirmation. A check for something she hadn't known she was being checked for. She started Monday. The first 3 weeks were surgical. Claire arrived at 6:45 every morning. Lorenzo arrived at 7. By the time his elevator reached 40 floors, her desk was organized. His day's documentation was staged in order of priority, and any overnight developments that required his attention had been summarized in a single typed page. No more, no less. Placed face down on his desk so he could choose when to look at it. He never commented on this. But the single page started appearing face up on his desk when she arrived, which she understood to mean he was reading it before she got there, which meant he was arriving earlier than 7 to do so, which meant he approved. She cataloged his habits the way a naturalist catalogs weather patterns. He drank espresso twice a day, once at 7 and once at 2, never in between, and he did not want it brought to him, he wanted it waiting. He returned calls in a specific sequence: legal first, then operations, then external partners, then family, which appeared in his contacts under individual first names only. He didn't like doors left partially open. He didn't like being updated on something he'd already decided. He didn't like the word hopefully. She made a list, and she did not violate it. What she also cataloged, without writing it down, were the other things. The calls that came in on a separate phone, matte black, no brand marking, that sat in his inside jacket pocket and which he answered in the small conference room off his office with the door fully closed. The men who sometimes came up in the freight elevator and met with him for 20 minutes at a time and left without being logged in the visitor system. The way certain names produced a particular stillness in his face. Not anger, not concern, something older than both. Something that had been trained down to almost nothing, but wasn't quite gone. Claire was not naive. She had grown up watching men like this from across certain kitchen tables. She knew the particular grammar of someone who had learned to inhabit 2 different worlds simultaneously and had become fluent enough in both that the seams barely showed. She said nothing. She did her job. It was the fourth week when the thing happened. She had come in at her normal time, earlier than usual, because there was a contract review required before an 8:30 call with a law firm in Zurich. The building was mostly empty. The man outside Lorenzo's office, there was always a man outside Lorenzo's office, nodded her through without the usual brief pause he gave everyone else, which she had learned to read as a signal that the morning was already complicated. Lorenzo was at his desk. He was on the black phone speaking quietly in Italian. He looked up when she entered, not sharply, just a glance, acknowledging, and continued the call. Claire moved to her adjacent station, pulled the Zurich documents, began organizing tabs. The call ended. She heard him set the phone down. She turned to bring the first document set to his desk and stopped. He had removed his jacket. It was draped over the back of his chair. He was standing at the side window in his shirt and suit trousers, looking out. And as he shifted slightly, turning back toward the desk, the morning light caught the left side of his torso at an angle that made something visible beneath the fine white fabric of his shirt. A shape. Solid, deliberate, strapped close to his ribs. She knew what it was. She'd grown up around enough of them to know instantly. But knowing and seeing, in the light of a business office on the 40th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, while she was holding a contract from a Zurich law firm, were two entirely different things. Her brain short-circuited for a single second. Not fear exactly, more like the sensation of two completely incompatible realities occupying the same space, and her eyes went to the shape and stayed there a half-beat too long. It was only half a second, maybe less. But he was already looking at her. Lorenzo Bellucci turned from the window, and in the absolute quiet of the office at 6:49 in the morning, he looked at her face and then looked at where her eyes were pointed, and then he looked back at her face again with an expression that was almost nothing except for the very small movement at the corner of his mouth. "Why can't you stop gazing at the bulge in my pants?" The words were completely level. No accusation in them, no amusement yet, just words asked the way you might ask someone if they'd remembered to forward a file. But the room felt like it had dropped 10 degrees, and Claire felt the blood leave her face, and she understood, in one horrifying crystalline second, that she had approximately 4 seconds to respond before this went permanently sideways. She said nothing. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Lorenzo's expression didn't change. He reached out and pressed a small button on the side of his desk, one she had never seen him press before, and said one word in Italian to whoever was listening on the other end. Then he looked back at her. "Sit down, Ms. Whitmore." The door behind her opened. She heard the sound of other people leaving. 2, maybe 3, the hushed shuffle of the morning assistants who had apparently been in the outer office, clearing out with a speed that suggested they'd received these instructions before. And then the door closed again, and it was just the two of them. The silence was complete. Claire sat. Her heartbeat was doing something structural, and her blister was screaming, and she was acutely, humiliatingly aware that she had not eaten since 5 in the morning, and that her hands were very, very still in her lap, because she was making them stay that way through concentrated force of will. Lorenzo walked around his desk, not toward her. He walked to the window again, clasped his hands behind his back, and for a moment he just stood there looking south over the city. She could see his reflection faintly in the glass, the controlled posture, the slight tension at the jaw that wasn't quite visible from the back. "How long," he said to the window, "have you known?" And there it was. Not what were you looking at, not an explanation, not a performance of normalcy to smooth over what she had seen. How long have you known? Which meant he already knew the answer to that question wasn't just now. Claire's throat worked once. She looked at her hands in her lap. She could feel the edge of the desk 2 feet away, the weight of the Zurich documents beside her. Contracts worth more than her entire career to date, neat and tabbed and color-coded, the most organized thing in the room. 3 days, she said quietly. The reflection in the glass shifted. 3 days, he repeated. The freight elevator, Tuesday. I was printing the Harmon reports when the doors were still open. She paused. I wasn't following anyone. I was early. I saw 2 men bring in something in a case, and I saw the way your security positioned around them. I've seen that configuration before. She stopped herself from saying where. I concluded it wasn't something that belonged in the visitor log. She heard him exhale. It wasn't a sigh. It was something more controlled than that. A deliberate release of something he'd been holding without knowing it. And you said nothing. It wasn't my information to say anything about. He turned away from the window then. He walked back to his desk but didn't sit. He stood on the other side of it and looked at her with those dark, efficient eyes, and she looked back and didn't drop her gaze. You could have gone to HR, he said. You could have gone to anyone. I could have. She paused. That seemed like a waste of time. She heard it the moment it came out, the echo of her own words from the interview, and something in his expression shifted by a fraction. Not quite a smile, the shape of one, gone before it finished forming. He reached into the drawer, pulled out a small folded card, and set it on the desk between them. There's a meeting tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. It is not on the calendar you have access to. He straightened up. It will be, starting tomorrow. You'll need clearance for the annex on 39. Daniel will arrange it this afternoon. That was all. He put his jacket back on and sat down and looked at the legal pad, and she understood that the conversation was over and that she had either just passed something or failed it so completely that the consequences were still forming on the other side of the city. She stood, gathered the Zurich documents, turned toward her desk. Miss Whitmore? She stopped. The shoulder holster, he said, without looking up. It is a Galco Miami Classic, custom fitted. The configuration you saw in the freight elevator was standard protective procedure for the transport of bearer documents, not weapons. He turned a page on the legal pad. You may be wondering why I'm telling you this. She waited. Because, he said, and his pen moved across the page, the next time you see something you're not supposed to see, I need to know within the hour, not 3 days later. Claire stood in the quiet of that room with the Manhattan skyline pressing against every window, and the blister burning through her left heel, and the Zurich documents balanced in the crook of her arm, and she said, Understood. She went back to her desk. She organized the tabs in silence. She did not let herself think about what bearer documents required that kind of security transport, or what the small button on the side of his desk connected to, or why a man who ran a legitimate holding company needed a Galco Miami Classic fitted to his body every single morning before 7 a.m. She told herself she would not think about those things. By noon, she had thought about nothing else. And somewhere in the building beneath her, on 39, in the annex she didn't yet have access to, something was already happening that would eventually make every careful, disciplined thought she had managed to suppress come crashing back with the full weight of everything she was not supposed to know. But that was tomorrow. Today she had a Zurich call at 8:30, and a trader she didn't know existed yet, and a boss whose real name she was only beginning to understand. And her hands stayed very, very still. The clearance card arrived on her desk at 2:17 in the afternoon. Daniel set it down without a word. A matte black rectangle, slightly thicker than a standard key card, with a single white stripe across the center and no name printed anywhere on it. Just a number sequence along the bottom edge that meant nothing to her yet. He placed it at a precise right angle to the corner of her keyboard and walked away without making eye contact, which she had learned to read as his version of "This is above my pay grade, and I would prefer not to know anything further." Claire picked it up, turned it over. The back was blank. She set it next to her water glass and went back to the Harmon filing. She didn't go to 39 that afternoon. The meeting wasn't until tomorrow morning, and she didn't know the layout, and showing up unannounced in a space she'd been granted access to approximately 4 hours ago seemed like precisely the kind of move that would undo whatever she had managed to build in that office at 6:49 this morning. So she stayed at her desk, and she did her job, and at 6:15 she packed her bag and rode the elevator down to the lobby and walked out onto 57th Street into air that smelled like diesel and rain that hadn't fallen yet. On the subway home, she stood with one hand on the bar and stared at nothing and thought about shoulder holsters and bearer documents and a button on the side of a desk that cleared a room in under 60 seconds. She did not sleep well. The annex on 39 was not what she expected. She had constructed a version of it in her head during the night. Something dark, reinforced, humming with the kind of paranoid energy that came with secrets. What she found when the elevator opened at 6:53 was a floor that looked like any other floor in the building except quieter. Open plan, low lighting not yet fully activated, 6 workstations arranged in a horseshoe around a central table. 2 of the workstations were occupied. A man she'd never seen, mid-40s, heavy through the shoulders, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, looked up when she entered and then looked away without speaking. A woman with close-cropped gray hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades at a standing desk did not look up at all. At the head of the central table, Lorenzo was already there. He was standing with his arms crossed, his jacket on today, looking at something laid out flat on the table. 2 other men stood flanking him. One she recognized as Victor, the head of building security, a Ukrainian she'd interacted with exactly 4 times and who had never once addressed her directly. The other she didn't know. Younger, narrow-faced, with the kind of controlled stillness that wasn't training so much as nature. Lorenzo looked up when she came in. "Sit there," he said, nodding toward the station nearest the table. "You're not observing, you're documenting." She sat. She pulled out her notepad. She looked at the table. Spread across it was a series of printed pages. Financial statements. She could see that much from 6 feet away. Multicolumn, dense with figures. And what looked like 3 separate wire transfer records with certain numbers circled in red marker. 18 million, Lorenzo said, not to her, picking up where he'd evidently left off. Moved in 4 transfers across 6 weeks, through Cayman, then Cyprus, then back into a shell in Delaware. He tapped the paper without looking at it. And the Delaware shell feeds into what? The narrow-faced man said, "On paper, it terminates there." On paper. Yes. Lorenzo looked at him steadily for a moment. And not on paper. The narrow-faced man, she would learn his name was Caruso, just Caruso, no first name ever offered, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. "We think it continues. We haven't confirmed where." "You think?" "We have 3 data points that suggest—" "3 data points," Lorenzo said, with a flatness that stopped Caruso mid-sentence as efficiently as a hand around a throat. $18 million and 3 data points. Silence. Claire wrote. She wrote 18 million, 4 transfers, 6 weeks. Cayman, Cyprus, Delaware shell, and she did not look up from the page, and she did not react to anything, and she made herself breathe at a normal rate because the room was already pressurized enough without her adding anything to it. Victor spoke for the first time. The accountant's signature appears on 2 of the 4 transfer authorizations. "Ricci," Lorenzo said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Ricci, who has been with this company for 9 years." "Yes." Lorenzo put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward and looked at the documents and said nothing for a long time. The room stayed very still. Claire could hear the ventilation system running, a low, neutral hum. And outside the half-activated windows, the city was already awake and moving and had no idea any of this was happening 40 floors above its head. "I want everything on every account Ricci has touched in the last 18 months, Lorenzo said. "I want it by end of day. I want it without Ricci knowing it's being pulled." He stood up straight. "And I want to know who authorized his system access on the Meridian accounts, because it wasn't me, and it wasn't legal. And that means someone signed off on it who is either very stupid or very deliberate, and I need to know which before I decide what to do about it." He picked up 2 of the printed pages, folded them, and handed them to Claire without looking at her. "Transcribe these and delete the transcription from your standard server. I'll give you a secondary access code after this meeting. The document lives there and nowhere else." She took the pages. "Understood." He looked at her then, briefly, the same efficient assessment, and she had the distinct sense that he was checking not whether she could do the task, but whether she had understood the weight of what she was holding. She met his eyes and held them for 2 seconds and looked back at the pages. Whatever he saw, he moved on. Ricci arrived at 8:05. She heard him before she saw him. A voice in the corridor outside her desk that was slightly too loud for the hour, the particular performance of a man who was used to filling whatever space he entered. Frank Ricci, chief accountant, had been at the Bellucci Group since before the American expansion. He was 53, built like someone who had been athletic in another decade and hadn't fully surrendered the posture, silver-haired, precisely dressed, with a handshake she had received once during her first week that had lasted slightly too long. He came through the outer office and stopped at her desk. "Morning." He smiled at her. It was a good smile. Practiced, easy, the kind that landed differently on different people. "Is he in?" "He has calls until 9:30, she said. "Do you have a scheduled—" "He'll see me," already moving toward the door. "Mr. Ricci." She said it without inflection, and he stopped, which surprised her. She hadn't been certain he would. "He has calls until 9:30. I can let him know you stopped by and find you a window for this afternoon." He looked at her for a moment. The smile stayed, but something shifted behind it. "It's a time-sensitive matter." "I'll pass that along," she said. "Would 11 work, or does your afternoon look better?" 3 seconds passed. "11 is fine," he said. He left. Claire picked up her phone and typed one line to Lorenzo's secondary contact, the one he'd given her that morning that was not his main line and not the matte black phone. A third number she had not previously known existed. Ricci came by. "Pushing to see you. Told him 11. Confirmed?" The response came back in under 40 seconds. "Confirmed. Good." She set the phone down and went back to the transcription. But the 11 o'clock meeting happened behind closed doors. Claire was at her desk for all of it, which meant she heard nothing, which was the point. What she observed was duration, 42 minutes, which was long for an internal meeting that Ricci had framed as urgent. And she observed Ricci's face when he came out. He was not a man who showed things easily, but there was a tension at the corner of his jaw and a deliberateness to his walk, the particular way a person moves when they are concentrating on moving normally, that told her the meeting had not gone the way he'd scripted it. He didn't stop at her desk on the way out. She noted this. The secondary server access code came on a slip of paper at 1:15, paper, not digital, which she understood was itself a message about how seriously this was meant to be taken. She entered the code, accessed the partition Lorenzo had created, and began building the document structure for the transcribed financial records. It was while she was entering the second wire transfer sequence that she saw it. She almost didn't. It was in the routing detail of the third transfer, the Cypress leg, buried in a 7-digit beneficiary code that would have looked like any standard correspondent bank identifier to anyone not specifically looking at it. But Claire had spent 3 years at Hargrove Capital reviewing international wire documentation, and she had developed the particular eye for anomaly that came from spending enough time staring at things that were supposed to be consistent until you could see exactly the moment they weren't. The beneficiary code on the third transfer terminated at a routing number she recognized. Not from the Bellucci Group's documentation. From somewhere else. Somewhere old. She sat very still for a moment. Then she pulled up a separate unconnected window and cross-referenced the routing number against a public financial registry database, a search anyone could run, nothing proprietary, and let it process. The result came back in 11 seconds. The routing number belonged to a correspondent account registered to a holding company called Vantero Capital LLC, incorporated in Delaware, with a listed address in Wilmington that was shared by approximately 600 other shell entities. Vantero Capital LLC. She searched it. Incorporated 8 years ago. No public filings beyond the state registration. No executives listed. No website, no press mentions, completely inert in every public-facing way. Except there was a single court filing, a civil dispute over a breached services contract from 4 years ago, a minor suit that had been settled out of court and dismissed, and therefore visible in the public record. The opposing party in that suit had been a logistics company called Stratford Meridian Partners. She searched Stratford Meridian Partners, dissolved 2 years ago, formerly headquartered in a building on the west side of Manhattan, former registered agent, a law firm that no longer existed under that name. She would have stopped there. Any reasonable person would have stopped there. A chain of dead-end entities, shells inside shells, the usual Russian nesting doll of financial obfuscation that meant either fraud or someone's very aggressive tax structuring. But there was one more thing in the civil filing, a detail so small it had clearly never been considered important enough to redact. The name of the individual who had signed the breach complaint on behalf of Stratford Meridian Partners. Dominic Farrow. She didn't know that name. She searched it. What came back was not extensive. A LinkedIn profile, inactive for 3 years, listing his most recent role out as Director of Operations, Betrayal Capital LLC. A single news mention from 5 years ago in a regional New Jersey business journal noting his attendance at an industry conference. And one photograph, grainy, embedded in a website for a charity gala that had taken place 7 years ago in Atlantic City. She enlarged the photograph. Dominic Farrow was standing at the edge of a group of men in formal wear. He was smiling at the camera. Beside him, close, relaxed, with the ease of men who had known each other long enough to stop performing, stood 2 other men she didn't recognize, and 1 man she did. He was younger in the photograph. The lines at his jaw weren't as deep, but the posture was identical, and the eyes, even in a low-resolution gala photograph from 7 years ago, were absolutely unmistakable. Frank Ricci. She stared at the screen. Her hands had stopped moving. The ventilation system hummed. Outside her window, the afternoon light was doing something with the glass towers to the east, catching them at the right angle, turning the whole upper half of the city the color of old gold. She thought about the meeting she had transcribed that morning, the $18 million, the 4 transfers through 3 jurisdictions, the signature on 2 of the 4 authorizations. She thought about Ricci's face coming out of the closed-door meeting at 11:52, the jaw, the deliberate walk. She thought about a man named Dominic Farrow, who directed operations at a shell company that was connected to the 3rd leg of a wire transfer that was connected to $18 million that someone was trying to find and couldn't. She reached for her secondary phone, the one Lorenzo had given her this morning, the 3rd number, and stopped. She pulled her hand back. She sat there for a full minute and she thought about what she was about to do. Not whether to do it. That question had already answered itself somewhere in the 3 seconds between recognizing Ricci's face in the photograph and reaching for the phone. But how? The shape of it. What she said and what she didn't say, and whether this phone was truly as contained as she'd been told it was, and whether, if she was wrong about any single component of this chain of connections, she was about to walk herself into something that would be very difficult to walk out of. She wasn't wrong. She picked up the phone and typed, "Need 10 minutes. Not by phone. Tonight, if possible." The response came back faster than the last one. "My office, 6:30. Come up through 39. She read it twice. She deleted both messages per the protocol he'd established and went back to the document on the secondary server and sat with her hands folded on the desk and watched the clock move. At 4:50, Caruso appeared at her desk. She hadn't heard him coming. He moved with that unnerving quality of someone who had practiced not announcing himself. And he was simply there, standing at the edge of her station with his hands in his pockets and his narrow face arranged into something that was not quite an expression. "You pulled something off the external registry this afternoon," he said. It wasn't a question either. Claire looked at him. "I did." "The routing lookup." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. "That query flags." She held his gaze. "I know. I assume that's why you're here." Something shifted in his face. Not warmth. She doubted warmth was in Caruso's standard repertoire, but something adjacent to reassessment. "What did you find?" "I have a meeting at 6:30, she said. "I'll present it then." "I'm asking now." "I understand that." She looked at him steadily. "I'll present it at 6:30. Caruso looked at her for a long moment. She could see him calculating. Whether to push, whether to go around her. Whether what she'd found was important enough to override whatever the 6:30 meeting represented. And she sat very still and let him calculate and did not fill the silence. He left without another word. She exhaled. Her hands were steady. The rest of her was not, entirely, but her hands were steady, and that was enough. The 6:30 meeting was just the 2 of them. Lorenzo listened without interrupting. She laid it out in order. The routing number, Betrayal Capital, Stratford Meridian, the civil filing, Dominic Farrow, the photograph. She had printed nothing. She had been careful to print nothing, but she had the search results open on the secondary device he'd issued her, and she turned the screen toward him at the appropriate moments. When she finished, he didn't speak for a while. He was standing at the window again. The city below was beginning its evening conversion, lights coming on floor by floor in the buildings across the park. That specific hour when Manhattan stopped being a place where people worked and became something else entirely, something older and less patient. "Pharaoh, son," he said finally. "You know the name." It wasn't a question. She'd stopped asking those. "I know what Pharaoh works for," he said. "Who he works for." He turned from the window. "How certain are you about the photograph?" "It's low resolution," she said, "but the posture is specific, the jawline, and they're standing close enough that it's not incidental proximity. These are two men who are comfortable with each other." "Comfortable," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "You understand what you're suggesting." "I understand what the evidence suggests," she said. "I'm not suggesting anything beyond what I found." He walked back to the desk and stood there with his hands on the edge of it. The same position as the morning of her interview, the same controlled weight forward. And he looked at the secondary device screen for a long time. 9 years, he said quietly. She didn't respond to that. There was nothing to respond to. 9 years and the signatures on the cypress leg, he said, more to himself than to her. Not the Delaware entry, the cypress leg. His jaw tightened. Which means he knew we'd look at Delaware first. The room stayed quiet. Then he straightened up and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the flat efficiency of the morning, not the controlled tension of the 39 meeting, but something underneath all of that. Something that didn't belong to the tailored suit or the corner office or any of the architecture he'd built around himself. "Who else knows you found this?" "Caruso came to my desk at 4:50, she said. "He knew about the routing query. I told him I'd present at 6:30. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I told him I'd present at 6:30. He looked at her for a long moment. "And he accepted that." "He left," she said. "I don't know if he accepted it." Something moved through Lorenzo's eyes, fast, contained. "Go home," he said. "Different exit than you usually use. Take the freight elevator to the loading dock, go out on 56th. Don't take your usual subway." She absorbed this. "Should I be concerned?" He picked up the matte black phone. "Go home, Miss Whitmore." She stood. She gathered the secondary device. He shook his head slightly, and she set it back on the desk. She picked up only her bag and walked toward the door, and then stopped because something had landed in the back of her mind and she couldn't leave without asking it. "The meeting this morning," she said. "On 39. You brought me in to document." "Yes." "You could have had Caruso document it." He looked at her without speaking. "You already knew about Ricci," she said. "Before this morning. You had the wire records before I ever saw them. You already knew the name on 2 of the authorizations." He still didn't speak. "You wanted a second set of eyes," she said. "Someone who didn't already know what they were looking at." The silence stretched. Outside the window, the city glittered and moved and had no interest in any of this. "You found something Caruso didn't find," Lorenzo said finally. "That's the answer to what you're not quite asking." She stood there with that for a moment. "Good night, Mr. Bellucci," she said. She went to the door. "Miss Whitmore?" She stopped. "The freight elevator?" His voice was flat and precise and entirely without room for interpretation. "Not the main." She took the freight elevator. She went out through the loading dock. She walked west on 56 with her bag tight against her side, and the city pressing in from every direction, and the blister on her left heel tearing open with every step. And she didn't stop until she was 3 blocks away. And then she stopped under a scaffolding and leaned against the cold steel pipe and breathed for a moment. Just breathed, in and out, the smell of wet concrete and somebody's food cart somewhere upwind and the diesel perpetual heartbeat of Midtown at 6:30. She pulled out her personal phone, not the secondary device, her own, and looked at it. No messages. She put it away. She thought about Ricci and 9 years and the cypress leg and a man named Dominic Farrow standing close enough to someone at a charity gala to suggest something that couldn't be unseen now that it had been seen. She thought about Caruso at her desk at 4:50. That query flags. The specific phrasing of it. Not "why did you run that query" or "what were you looking for?" Just the plain statement of mechanism. That query flags. Which meant someone had set the flag. which meant someone had anticipated that particular search being run, which meant whoever set the flag already knew, or suspected, that the routing number would be found eventually and had put a wire on it. A tripwire. Waiting. She stood very still under the scaffolding on 56th Street and let that thought complete itself and felt the specific cold sensation of understanding something you would very much have preferred not to understand. The flag wasn't set to catch an intruder searching the registry. The flag was set to catch whoever inside the company started looking. She started walking again, fast, head down, threading through the evening crowd with her bag against her ribs and her ruined heel hitting the pavement and her mind running very, very clean. The way it only ran when things had become serious enough to burn off everything extraneous. Someone inside the Bellucci group had set a trap, and she had walked straight into it. And the only question that mattered now, the only question that had any practical value, was whether the person who had set that trap had gotten what they wanted from her today, or whether they were still waiting. She reached the corner of 8th Avenue and stopped at the light and stood there in the river of bodies moving around her, and she looked at her reflection in the dark glass of a building across the street. Small, still, a woman with a bag and a blister and a clearance card she hadn't asked for, and she thought, "You have until tomorrow morning to figure out which one it is." The light changed. She crossed, and somewhere behind her, in the Meridian Tower on 57th Street, a phone rang in an office she was no longer in, the matte black one, the one with no brand marking. And the man who answered it listened for 11 seconds without speaking, and then said 2 words into it that she would not hear until it was almost too late. 2 words. He knows. She didn't sleep. Not the kind of not sleeping where you lie in the dark and chase thoughts in circles until exhaustion finally takes you somewhere shallow and gray. This was different. This was the particular wakefulness of someone whose nervous system had made a unilateral decision that rest was a liability and was enforcing that decision with total authority. Claire lay on her back in her apartment in Astoria with her eyes on the water stain on the ceiling, the one shaped like nothing in particular that she'd been meaning to report to the super for 4 months, and she ran it again. From the beginning, the routing number, Vantero Capital, Stratford Meridian, Faro. The photograph, Caruso at her desk. The query flags, the specific grammar of it, so flat and mechanical, like he was reading from an instruction set rather than responding to a human being. The flag wasn't set to catch an intruder. She kept coming back to that. At 2 a.m, she got up and made coffee she didn't drink and stood at the kitchen window looking at the street below. A cab moved through the intersection. A man walked a dog that was too small for the leash he was using. The city maintained its low-grade nocturnal hum. Never silent, just quieter. A version of itself that ran on different frequencies. She thought about the 2 words. He knows. She hadn't heard them. She didn't know they had been spoken. What she knew was the shape of the trap she had walked into, and what that implied about who had built it, and what that meant for what was going to happen when she walked back into the Meridian Tower in approximately 4 hours. She poured the coffee down the drain and went back to bed, and stared at the ceiling until 5:15 when she got up and showered and dressed and was out the door by 6. She did not take her usual route. The building felt different at 6:40 in the morning, or she felt different in it. That was probably more accurate. The lobby had the same marble floors and the same security desk and the same elevator bank she'd been using for 4 weeks, and none of it had changed, but she moved through it with a new kind of attention, the kind that noticed things it had previously categorized as ambient. The security guard who signed her in, young, second week on the job, she'd clocked this during her first days, made brief eye contact and looked away too quickly. The elevator arrived faster than usual, which meant it had already been on this floor, waiting, which meant someone had sent it. She stepped in, pressed 40. The doors closed. She watched the floors climb and kept her breathing even and thought about exits. Not in a catastrophizing way, so about practically. The building had 4 stairwells, 2 freight access points, and a service corridor on each floor that connected to the freight elevator. She had memorized this during her second week because she memorized floor plans the way other people memorized song lyrics, automatically, structurally, for no immediate reason except that her brain treated spatial information as essential. The elevator opened on 40. Caruso was standing directly outside it. Not at her desk, not in the outer office. Standing in front of the elevator, hands in his pockets, looking at the floor numbers above the door the way people look at things when they are not actually looking at them but need somewhere to put their eyes. He looked at her. "Morning," she said. "He wants you on 39, Caruso said. "Now." She stepped out of the elevator. "My desk." 39, he said. "Now." She looked at him for 1 second and then nodded and walked back to the elevator and pressed 39 and watched the doors close with Caruso still standing there, not moving toward the elevator, not following her. Which meant he wasn't coming, which meant this had been a delivery, not an escort. The distinction mattered and she filed it. 39 was not the way she'd left it. The horseshoe of workstations was the same, the low lighting the same, but the central table had been cleared of everything. The wire transfer records, the printed statements, all of it. And in its place were 2 laptops, open, and a phone on speaker emitting the low warble of an active but unmuted line on hold. Lorenzo was at the table. Victor was behind him, standing against the wall with his arms crossed. The woman with the close-cropped gray hair, Claire still didn't have a name for her, was at one of the workstations, typing without looking at the keyboard. And in the chair across from Lorenzo, sitting with his hands folded on the table, with the specific composure of a man who had decided that composure was the only card he had left, was Frank Ricci. Claire stopped in the doorway. Ricci looked at her. His face did something, a small, involuntary tightening at the eyes, that was the most honest thing she'd seen on it in 4 weeks. "Close the door," Lorenzo said. She closed it. "Sit." She sat at the workstation nearest the door, which was not where she'd been told to sit yesterday, and nobody corrected her. She pulled out her notepad. She looked at her pen. She did not look at Ricci. Lorenzo looked at Ricci. "Tell her what you told me," he said. Ricci's jaw moved. He looked at his folded hands and then looked at Lorenzo, and then looked at nothing in particular in the middle distance and said, "The routing number you found doesn't go to Vantero." The room was quiet enough that she could hear the hold music on the open phone line, something bland and corporate, a single synthesizer chord repeating. Claire kept her voice flat. "I searched the public registry. The registry is wrong," Ricci said. "Or rather, it's been made to look right. Someone rerouted the identifier 2 weeks ago, on the back end, changed the registration documentation so that a search would return Vantero, and Vantero would trace back to Faro, and Faro would trace back to me." He paused. "It was meant to be found. The trail was built to be found." She looked at him for a long moment. "By me, specifically," she said. He didn't answer that, which was its own answer. She looked at Lorenzo. His face had the quality of very old stone. Not cold, not hard, just finished moving a long time ago and settled into permanent form. He was watching her absorb this, and he was letting her absorb it at her own pace, which she recognized as its own kind of cruelty, because it meant he already knew what she was going to land on, and he was giving her the room to get there herself. She set her pen down. She looked at the table. Vantero. Faro. The photograph. The gala in Atlantic City 7 years ago, Ricci standing close enough to suggest familiarity. The photograph that she had found. The search that had flagged. Caruso at her desk at 4:50. That query flags. Not why did you run it, just the statement, the confirmation. A man confirming that a mechanism had activated. Not warning her, confirming. She picked up her pen again. "The photograph," she said. "The gala. Ricci and Faro." "Real photograph," Ricci said. "Faro and I do know each other. We were at the same conference 7 years ago. We're in the same frame by coincidence, or close enough to coincidence that nobody would be able to prove otherwise." He looked at her. "It's very good work, Ms. Whitmore. Whoever built it understood that the most convincing frame uses 80% real material." She thought about that. She thought about the routing query flagging, the speed of the flag, the fact that Caruso had been at her desk in under 3 hours. Not because the flag had been set to catch intruders, but because it had been set to catch exactly this. Someone inside following the trail. "Caruso," she said. Lorenzo looked at her. "Caruso set the flag on the routing query," she said. Not a question. "Caruso flagged it to me," Lorenzo said. Yes. And you knew I'd run it. He looked at her with those settled, finished eyes. I knew someone would run it. I needed to know who. The room held very, very still. She understood then, not slowly, not in pieces, but all at once, with the nauseating completeness of understanding that rearranges everything you thought you knew and leaves you standing in a room that looks the same as it did 10 seconds ago, but is structurally different in every way that matters. The meeting on 39 yesterday morning, the wire record spread out on the table, her sitting at the workstation nearest the table, close enough to read the figures, with the routing details visible. He had not hidden the cypress leg from her. He had placed it in her line of sight. She had been the test. Not the trap. The trap was for whoever else was watching her. She had been the controlled variable. The person introduced into the system who had no prior relationship with any of it, no loyalties established, no information already in her head that could be manipulated. A clean instrument. He'd handed her a loaded problem and watched what she did with it and what she found and, most critically, what she did with what she found. And she had gone directly to him, through the right channel, at the right time. And in doing so, she had confirmed something he needed confirmed. I was a test, she said. You were an asset, Lorenzo said. An asset I needed to verify. That's the same thing. It is not the same thing. She looked at him. The distinction matters to you. The distinction matters to the situation, he said, which is currently that someone inside this organization planted a fabricated paper trail designed to implicate my chief accountant, routed it through a search path they calculated would eventually be found, and flagged the search so they would know the moment someone started pulling that thread. He leaned forward. And you pulled it inside one day, faster than anyone anticipated. Including you, she said. A pause. Yes. She looked at Ricci. So you're not the source. I'm not the source, Ricci said. He had the exhausted dignity of a man who had spent the night being interrogated by his employer of 9 years and had come out the other side still seated at the table, which was probably the best he'd been hoping for. But someone used you, she said. Your signature on the authorizations? Forged, he said, digitally. Whoever did it had access to my authentication credentials and knew my standard authorization format. Which means they had system access at an administrative level. Which means, Lorenzo said, they're inside, not peripherally, centrally. She thought about centrally. She thought about the annex, the secondary server, the clearance card that had appeared on her desk less than 24 hours ago, the number of people who knew she'd been given it. She thought about Caruso. She looked at Lorenzo. How far does Caruso's system access go? The silence that followed had a specific texture, not the silence of a question that hadn't been expected, but the silence of one that had been anticipated and for which no clean answer had been prepared. Victor shifted against the wall. Not much, half a step, a slight adjustment of weight, but enough. Caruso has administrative access, Lorenzo said carefully, to the secondary server, to certain partitions. The partition you gave me yesterday. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes. She set her pen down again. Then Caruso knew what I was transcribing yesterday. Before I found the routing number, before the flag fired, he already knew what material I had access to. Lorenzo said nothing. And when the flag fired, he came to my desk not to stop me, but to find out how far I'd gotten. She looked at the table. He wasn't containing the situation. He was assessing it. The hold music on the open phone line continued its patient idiot repetition. Lorenzo reached out and ended the call. The silence that replaced it was complete and entirely different. I've known Caruso for 12 years, Lorenzo said. His voice had not changed, still flat, still controlled, but something in the room had shifted in the way that rooms shift when the thing that's been unsayable finally gets said. I know, she said. You understand what you're suggesting. I understand what the access levels suggest, she said. I'm not... Don't, he said, quiet, sharp. Don't say you're not suggesting anything. You found Pharaoh. You found the photograph. You found the routing discrepancy. And now you're sitting here telling me my head of internal security, who has been with me since before I opened this building, Has the architecture to have built every piece of what we're looking at. He looked at her. That is a suggestion, Ms. Whitmore. Own it or don't make it. The air in the room was very thin. She held his gaze. Caruso has the access, she said. Caruso knew the search path. Caruso set the flag, and Caruso was at my desk in under 3 hours, and Caruso did not ask me what I found. He stated that the flag had fired and waited to see what I would do. She paused. That is the sequence. What you do with the sequence is your decision, but you asked me why I'm telling you. I didn't ask. You were going to. Something moved through his eyes. It happened quickly and was gone. Ricci made a sound, but not a word, just a short exhale, the kind that meant I am sitting here in the ruins of a situation I didn't create, and I would very much like to be somewhere else. Neither of them looked at him. Lorenzo stood. He walked to the window. The same instinct, the same move, turning away from the room to think. The morning light had not finished deciding what it was going to do with the day. The sky above the buildings was the gray-white of something just before it commits, and he stood in it and was very still. Then he said without turning, Victor, find Caruso. Tell him I need him on 39 in 15 minutes. Don't tell him why. Victor moved toward the door. His footsteps were very quiet for a man his size. Don't let him access any system between now and when he's in this room, Lorenzo added. Victor left. Ricci unfolded his hands and refolded them differently, which was the only sign he was still breathing. Claire sat with her notepad and her pen and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to add, and she was still processing the part of this that she had not said out loud yet. The part that she had almost said and had stopped herself at the last possible second because the room was already at its load-bearing limit, and adding this to it felt like placing one more thing on a structure that was deciding whether to hold. Caruso had set the flag. But Caruso had not built the fabricated trail alone. The document manipulation, the rerouted routing identifier, the forged authorizations, that was not one person's work. That was a campaign. Extended, coordinated, technically sophisticated enough to fool an internal audit under normal circumstances. Caruso was connected to something larger. And whatever that something was, it had been watching the Bellucci group from the inside long enough to know how it moved and what it used, and who to frame, and how to route a trail that would pass 4 levels of scrutiny before it unraveled. And then Claire had unraveled it in one afternoon, which meant that whatever came next was already accelerating. Because a trap that gets found by the wrong person ahead of schedule doesn't just sit quietly, it responds. Whoever was on the other side of this, whoever had built it, whoever Caruso answered to when he wasn't answering to Lorenzo, they had flagged her search. They knew she'd pulled the thread. They knew what she'd found, and they had had approximately 16 hours to decide what to do about it. She looked at her phone, her personal one, in her bag, dark, no messages. She put it away. Lorenzo turned from the window. He came back to the table and sat down and looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing to unguarded she had seen on him. You should have gone home last night and stayed home, he said. You told me to go home, she said. You didn't tell me to stay there. The implication, I came in early through the secondary entrance, she said. I varied my route. I'm at a workstation I don't normally use. She paused. I'm not unaware of what I walked back into this morning. He looked at her. What I'm telling you, she said, is that whoever built this already knows I found it, which means the clock on whatever they had planned has changed. They'll either accelerate or abort. And if they accelerate, the door opened. Victor was in the frame, alone. The specific quality of Victor's stillness had changed in the last 12 minutes in a way that was immediately and completely legible. It was the stillness of someone delivering information they wished they were not delivering, recalibrated into the posture of professional neutrality because that was the only available container for it. Lorenzo looked at him. Caruso is not in the building, Victor said. The room absorbed this. His keycard was used at 6:03 this morning, Victor continued. Lobby level, exit, not entry. The security camera on the south exit, he paused. It was offline between 6 and 6:15. Of course it was. Lorenzo did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and the gray-white morning light falling across him and his face doing exactly nothing. His workstation, Lorenzo said. Wiped, Victor said. Remotely. The wipe initiated at 11:47 last night. 11:47. Claire ran the numbers without meaning to. 11:47 was 73 minutes after she had left the building. 73 minutes after Lorenzo had told her to go home. 73 minutes after he had picked up the matte black phone and she had walked out into the corridor and pressed the button for the freight elevator. 73 minutes after he knows. She felt it land in her chest, cold and precise and final, the way things land when they stop being possibilities and become facts. He was in the building, she said. Her voice came out completely level, which surprised her. When you got that call last night, Caruso was still in the building. Lorenzo looked at her. He heard the call, she said, or he was on it, one or the other. She looked at the table. The system wipe at 11:47. He wasn't panicking. He'd already planned the exit. He was just waiting for confirmation that it was time. The silence in the room was of a very specific structural kind. Lorenzo stood up from the table. He walked around it once, a single circuit, slow, controlled, and came to a stop behind his own chair with his hands on the back of it. And he looked at the doorway Victor was still standing in. And then he looked at Ricci, who had the gray, hollow appearance of a man watching a building he'd worked in for 9 years burn. And then he looked at Claire. The documents you transcribed to the secondary server, he said. Yes. Caruso's access to that partition. If he pulled the files after 11 last night, before the wipe, he has everything we had, Lorenzo said. He has everything we had, she confirmed. Ricci put his face in his hands. Not dramatically, just the quiet collapse of a man hitting the wall of what he could hold upright. Lorenzo said, very quietly, to no one in particular, 12 years. Nobody answered that. There was no answer for it. Outside the window, the sky had finished its deliberation and committed to gray. The thick, total gray of a New York morning that had decided it wasn't going to clear, that whatever happened today was going to happen under that particular sky, with that particular light pressing down on everything and offering no warmth and no visibility past the immediate. Claire looked at her notepad, at the sequence of notes she'd been keeping since she sat down. Vantero, Faro, Flag, Caruso, 603 exit, 11:47 wipe, and the line she could draw from the first word to the last. She thought about what it meant that Caruso had everything they had. She thought about $18 million and 4 wire transfers and a rival organization patient enough to spend months building a frame inside a company they wanted to destroy. She thought about what they would do now that the frame had been found before it could be used. If the frame was the prelude, the thing you build to create confusion and internal fracture before you move, and the frame had just collapsed, then what came next was not another frame. What came next was not subtle. She opened her mouth to say this. Her personal phone vibrated. She looked at it. Unknown number, text message, 3 words, leave the building. She stared at it. Lorenzo was watching her face. He read something in it and said, "What?" She turned the phone toward him. He looked at the 3 words, his jaw set. He looked at Victor. Lockdown. Now. All floors, all exits, nobody in or out without my direct. The explosion was not large. It was not even in the building. It was outside, below, somewhere on 57th Street. A concussive crack that shuddered through the glass of the windows and knocked something off the workstation nearest the wall and sent a crack running along the ceiling, plaster from the corner to the center of the room in a single jagged line, like a sentence being written in a language made entirely of damage. The alarm system fired 3 seconds later. The light shifted, primary to emergency, the room going from gray-white daylight to red-tinged backup power in one strobing instant. And in that changed light, the people in the room looked different, all of them, altered by the frequency into something more elemental and less composed. Ricci was on his feet. Victor had his weapon out. Lorenzo was at the window, looking down at 57th Street. Claire was already at the door, not running, moving, efficiently with the specific intentionality of someone who had processed the sequence from the text message to the explosion to the building's lockdown protocol in the 2 seconds it had taken everyone else to react to the sound, and had arrived at the conclusion that standing still in a room with one exit and no sightlines was a worse position than moving. "Ms. Whitmore," Lorenzo's voice, sharp, commanding, the voice of a man used to being the last word in any room. She stopped. She turned. He was still at the window, looking at her over his shoulder, and in the red-tinged emergency light, his face was all architecture. No softness, no ambiguity, just the underlying structure of the man he actually was, beneath every layer he'd built in 41 years of being exactly this. "Come here," he said. She crossed the room. She stood beside him at the window and looked down. On 57th Street, 40 floors below, a dark sedan was burning. The traffic around it had stopped. Cars splayed at angles, people on foot streaming away from the scene in every direction. The specific physics of sudden urban catastrophe reorganizing the street into something that no longer resembled a street. Emergency lights were already visible 2 blocks east, strobing blue and red in the gray morning, and moving against the flow of the crowd, moving toward the building, not away from it, which was the thing that distinguished them from everyone else on that sidewalk, were 4 men in dark clothing walking with the particular directional certainty of people who knew exactly where they were going. Lorenzo watched them. His hand came up and pressed the side of her arm, not grabbing, not pulling, just a flat pressure that communicated a single instruction more efficiently than any word could. "Stay." "Victor," he said. "I see them," Victor said. "Stairwell B, now." Victor moved. Lorenzo looked at Ricci. "Backup server. Pull everything on the Cayman account and get it onto the drive I gave you in March. The physical drive. Do it now." Ricci was already moving. That left the 2 of them at the window. She looked at the 4 men on the sidewalk below, at the burning sedan, at the cracked ceiling above her head and the red-tinted room, and the city spread out in every direction under a sky that had made up its mind to offer nothing. She thought about the text message. "Leave the building." Unknown number, 3 words, sent to her personal phone, the number she had never given to anyone connected to this building, the number that existed in no company record, no directory, nowhere. Sent before the explosion. Warning or instruction? She still didn't know which. Warning felt like an ally. Instruction felt like something else. And the difference between those 2 things was the difference between someone trying to protect her and someone trying to use her to clear a path. She did not say this to Lorenzo. She filed it. "The tunnels," she said instead. "You have access to the infrastructure tunnels under this block." He looked at her sideways. "How do you know about the tunnels?" "Building schematics from the city planning database," she said. "Public record? Your basement connects to the pre-war steam tunnel network under 57th. There's an access point on this block and an egress point 2 blocks west." She looked at him. "If Stairwell B is the planned route, they'll be covering Stairwell B." He held her gaze. Below them, the 4 men had reached the building entrance. "You have 30 seconds to decide," she said, "before they're in the elevator." Lorenzo Bellucci looked at her, through her almost, with those finished dark eyes, and in the red light of the emergency backup system with the city burning quietly below, and everything he'd built over 12 years actively collapsing around him, he made the decision that would change everything that came after. "Show me," he said, and Claire Whitmore, who had come to this job 4 weeks ago with a leather portfolio and a blister and nothing to lose, turned away from the window and walked toward the freight elevator and did not look back, because looking back was a luxury that neither of them had anymore. And the tunnels were 2 floors down, and the men in dark clothing were already in the lobby, and the only thing left between this moment and whatever came next was the distance between here and the door at the end of the corridor, and she intended to cover every inch of it. The freight elevator took 11 seconds to reach the basement, 11 seconds in which neither of them spoke. Lorenzo stood with his back against the wall of the car and his hand inside his jacket and his eyes on the door. Claire stood 18 inches to his left with her bag across her chest and her phone in her hand and her mind running the tunnel schematic she'd pulled from the city planning database 3 weeks ago, for no reason she could have articulated at the time, except that she cataloged things. She always cataloged things. It was the habit that had kept her employed, and occasionally it was the habit that kept her alive, and this appeared to be one of the latter occasions. The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto a service corridor, concrete, low ceiling, bare fluorescent tubes running the length of it, half of them dark. The smell was old water and metal, and the specific mineral cold of underground space that hadn't seen daylight since the building's construction. She went left without hesitating. Lorenzo fell in behind her and she heard him on the phone, the matte black one, speaking in rapid Italian. 3 words, a pause. 2 more words, a pause. She didn't catch all of it. What she caught was Stairwell B and a name she didn't recognize and a number that sounded like a floor. He ended the call. "Victor has 2 men on B," he said. "They'll hold as long as they can." "We won't need long," she said. 40 meters down this corridor, there's a utility door on the left. Behind it is a junction room. The tunnel access is through the north wall of the junction. Iron door, manual latch, no electronic lock. "You're certain?" "The schematic was from 1987, she said. "I'm certain about the schematic." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite not one. She moved fast. Not running. Running was noise, and noise was information given to people you didn't want informed. But moving with the compressed speed of someone who had converted all available urgency into forward motion. The corridor curved slightly to the right after the first 30 meters, following the building's foundation line, and the curve was where the light failed completely. Both fluorescent tubes dead, and she put one hand on the wall and kept moving by texture and schematic memory and the sound of Lorenzo 2 steps behind her. The utility door was where the schematic said it would be. She found the latch by feel, cold iron, stiff, requiring both hands and a specific upward pressure before it released, and pushed through into the junction room. The junction room smelled worse, older. Pipes running in 3 directions along the ceiling, some of them sweating, the concrete walls dark with decades of accumulated moisture. A single battery emergency light in the corner had activated at some point and was now providing approximately enough illumination to confirm the room's existence and not much else. She found the north wall. The iron door was there. It had a hasp latch and a padlock. She stared at the padlock for exactly 1 second. Lorenzo reached past her, his arm brushing her shoulder, and produced a key from his inside jacket pocket. He put it in the padlock on the first try. The padlock released. He pulled it free and handed it to her without commentary, which she interpreted as him having done some research of his own at some point about the infrastructure under his own building, which meant either he was more thorough than she'd given him credit for, or he'd needed this door before. She did not ask which. She pulled the iron door open. The tunnel beyond was narrow, 2 people abreast if they chose each other carefully, with a brick-arched ceiling that cleared Lorenzo's head by perhaps 4 inches, and a floor that was dry in patches and wet in others, and completely unpredictable in between. The emergency light from the junction room reached approximately 3 meters into it before giving up entirely. Claire pulled up the flashlight on her phone. 2 blocks west, she said. The egress comes up inside a building on 55th. Old commercial property. It's been through 3 owners in the last decade. The current tenant is a printing company, ground floor. The access hatch should be in the northwest corner of their storage room. Should be, he said. 1987, she said. He looked at her in the thin light of her phone screen, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not admiration exactly, and not assessment. Something between the two that didn't have a clean name. Move, he said. They moved. The tunnel took 6 minutes. 6 minutes of wet brick and uncertain footing and the low percussion of pipes above them, cycling through some industrial rhythm that had nothing to do with either of them, and the occasional distant resonance of what might have been footsteps, or might have been the building settling, or might have been something happening 40 feet above their heads on 57th Street that they were deliberately not positioned to see. She fell once, left knee, hard, into wet brick. She felt the skin open and the pain fire up through her thigh, and she put her hand down and pushed back up, and kept moving, and Lorenzo's hand was at her elbow for the 2 seconds it took her to regain her footing, and then it was gone, and neither of them mentioned it. The egress hatch was in the northwest corner. It was also padlocked. She looked at it. Lorenzo looked at it. Different lock, she said. He examined it. Commercial, standard. He looked around the junction at the base of the egress. Another small room, this one barely large enough for the 2 of them, and the pipes feeding upward. He found a length of iron pipe on the floor, loose, clearly original to the infrastructure. He picked it up and looked at the padlock hasp, and looked at the wall, mounting, and he hit the mounting, not the lock, 3 times, precise and controlled. And on the third strike, the screws pulled out of the aged brick, and the whole assembly came free. He handed her the iron pipe. She kept it. The hatch opened inward. She pushed up, and it gave with a sound of displaced dust and old hinges, and the light that fell through was fluorescent and commercial and smelled like ink and paper and someone's cold coffee. She went up first. The storage room was exactly what the city records had described: shelves of paper stock, industrial print supplies in labeled boxes, 2 idle pallet jacks against the far wall. Empty. The printing company apparently did not staff their storage room at 7:15 in the morning, which was the first clean piece of luck they'd had in the last 20 minutes. Lorenzo came up behind her. He replaced the hatch. He straightened his jacket, the automatic, unconscious gesture of a man recalibrating his exterior, and looked at the room. "We need a phone that isn't either of ours," Claire said. He reached into his left jacket pocket and produced a phone she had never seen before. Not the matte black, not his regular line, a third one, prepaid by the look of it, and handed it to her. She looked at him. "I rotate them," he said, which explained and did not explain. She took it. She dialed Victor's number from memory. She had memorized it during her second week because she memorized contact information the way she memorized floor plans, and put it on speaker and held it between them. Victor picked up on the second ring. "Where are you?" he said immediately, which meant he'd been waiting. "Clear," Lorenzo said. 55th. What's the building? 3 teams, Victor said. We stopped 2 on B. Third came through the loading dock on 40. They knew about the loading dock. A pause in which she could hear something that might have been voices or might have been the building's alarm system still cycling. Ricci got the drive out. He's clear. Caruso, Lorenzo said. A longer pause. We have a location, Victor said. He went to the waterfront. Brooklyn. There's a terminal sub, Strand Logistics, Red Hook. Decommissioned. It's Pharaoh's. She looked at Lorenzo. Pharaoh. The name she'd pulled from a civil filing. The man in the photograph at the Atlantic City Gala. The director of operations at Vantero Capital LLC. The shell company at the terminus of the fabricated wire trail. The company that was supposed to have led them to Ricci and destroyed the Bellucci group from the inside. Pharaoh had a terminal in Red Hook, and Caruso had gone there, with everything on the secondary server. With $18 million in wire documentation and the complete organizational architecture of the Bellucci Group's financial structure and 12 years of internal knowledge about how Lorenzo Bellucci operated and who he trusted and where the bodies were, metaphorical and possibly otherwise. How long ago, Lorenzo said. Caruso arrived at Red Hook approximately 40 minutes ago, Victor said. She did the math. 40 minutes ago was 6:35. Which was while they were still on 39, which was while the men in dark clothing were still on 57th Street, which meant the timing had been coordinated and the street-level distraction had been designed to hold the building's attention while Caruso was already on a bridge. The FBI, she said. Both men looked at her. She looked at Lorenzo. You have a contact, federal level. You mentioned legal on your call priority list. She held his gaze. If Pharaoh is operating out of Red Hook with what Caruso just handed him, and if what we have on the wire transfers is enough to show a rival organization running a financial infiltration campaign against a legitimate holding company. She paused. That's a federal case, not a street problem. Lorenzo looked at her for a long moment. You want me to call the FBI? He said. I want you to give them what we have before Pharaoh uses what Caruso gave him to give it to them first, she said. Whoever calls first controls the narrative. The storage room hummed with fluorescent light and the smell of ink and the distant sound of the city outside doing what cities do when a car has exploded on one of their streets, containing, rerouting, absorbing the event into its permanent background frequency of chaos. Lorenzo looked at the prepaid phone in her hand. Victor, he said, get everything we have on the wire transfers. The real trail, the Cayman origin, the actual beneficiary chain, to Ricci. Tell him to format it as a regulatory disclosure package, standard SAR format. He knows how. Done, Victor said. And the building? Hold it, Lorenzo said. Nobody leaves, Nobody gets higher than 30. Keep it locked until I say otherwise. He ended the call. He looked at Claire. Red Hook, he said. She had known he was going to say that. She had known it the moment Victor said waterfront and terminal and Pharaohs. Because a man like Lorenzo Bellucci did not hand the final confrontation of 12 years of work to a federal contact over a prepaid phone in a printing company's storage room. He would make the call, he would send the package, and then he would go to Red Hook. All right, she said, you're not coming. You don't have a car, she said. You don't have anyone available who isn't already in the building, and you need someone who can document what happens at that terminal in a form that is legally presentable. Because if you walk in there and do what you're planning to do, and there's no documentation, Pharaoh's lawyers will have the whole thing unraveled before the ink dries on whatever Victor sends to your federal contact. What? She looked at him steadily. You need a witness who isn't on your payroll in any capacity that can be characterized as loyal. You're on my payroll. I'm an executive secretary, she said. I take notes. He looked at her. She looked back. There's a car service 2 blocks north, she said. They open at 7. It's 7:22. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. You fall behind, he said. You stop. You don't follow. You find cover and you call Victor. Understood. I mean it. I know you mean it, she said. They went out through the storage room's street-level exit into the gray morning on 55th Street and turned north and did not run and did not look like what they were, which was 2 people with wet knees and brick dust on their sleeves, and the specific internal vibration of people operating several floors above their normal altitude of danger, walking through New York City at 7:22 in the morning while 40 floors above their heads, in a building that was locked down and alarmed. The last intact pieces of a 12-year empire either held or didn't. The car service had a black SUV available. The driver was a man in his 60s who had the metropolitan professional's gift of perfect incuriosity. He looked at Lorenzo and Claire and their condition, and the cash Lorenzo placed on the center console, and concluded that none of this was his business, which was correct, and drove south toward the Brooklyn Bridge without commentary. Lorenzo was on the prepaid phone for most of the drive. She heard fragments, names she didn't have context for, numbers, the name of a federal agent delivered with the flat confidence of someone who was calling in something that had been owed for a long time. The conversation was brief. Whatever the response was, it produced a silence in Lorenzo that was not relief exactly, but was adjacent to it, the release of a held position, tactical rather than emotional. He put the phone in his jacket. He looked out the window at the bridge cables moving past. The package goes in 30 minutes, he said. Complete wire documentation, the fabricated trail, the real trail, Caruso's system access history. He paused. It's enough. For them to move on Pharaoh. For them to move on the whole operation, he said. Pharaoh's been building a financial infiltration apparatus for 4 years. This isn't the first company. We're the first one that caught it. She absorbed this. The 18 million, she said, was never about the money, he said. It was about the access. Move money through a company's accounts and you own their transaction history. Own their transaction history and you can reconstruct their entire operation. Who they pay, who pays them, what they own, who they owe. He looked at her. It's reconnaissance, financial reconnaissance. And at the end of it, when you've mapped everything, you either sell the map or you use it. Caruso was the inside man from the beginning, she said. I don't know from the beginning, he said, but long enough. She thought about 12 years. She thought about what it cost a man like Lorenzo Bellucci to say, I don't know about something that had been living inside his organization for an indeterminate period of time. She thought about the particular specific grief of betrayal by someone you had chosen, and chosen deliberately, and trusted with the interior of everything you'd built. She said nothing about any of this. The car crossed into Brooklyn. The Strand Logistics Terminal sat at the end of a dead-end access road off Imlay Street in Red Hook, backed up against the water with the Manhattan skyline visible across the harbor in the gray morning light. Close enough to see, far enough to be a different world entirely. The terminal was decommissioned. That much was clear from the exterior chitan, chain-link fencing, posted notices weathered past legibility, 2 of the large roll doors secured with chains that had not moved in some time. The building itself was corrugated steel, large, built in the 70s and not substantially maintained since. The kind of structure the city had dozens of, old industrial bones kept upright by the cost of demolition being higher than the cost of neglect. But the access road had fresh tire tracks. And one of the personnel doors on the east side of the building, small, steel, set into the corrugated wall, had a light coming through the gap at the frame. The driver stopped at the end of the access road at Lorenzo's instruction and did not move and did not ask questions. They got out. Claire looked at the building, at the light in the doorframe, at the harbor behind it and the gray sky above it, and the perfect stillness of a waterfront at 7:40 in the morning when the shift hasn't started and the traffic hasn't arrived, and the only sound is water and the distant compression of a city that doesn't know this particular location exists. Lorenzo checked his weapon. He did it briefly, efficiently, with the automatic competence of someone for whom this was maintenance rather than preparation, and put it back in the holster beneath his jacket. He looked at her. "Behind me," he said. 6 feet. If the door is locked, stay outside." She nodded. They crossed the access road. He went to the personnel door and put his hand flat on it and pushed. It opened without resistance, which meant either it had been left deliberately unlocked or whoever was inside had decided that locking it was no longer relevant, and neither of those options was reassuring. The interior was vast and dim, the overhead industrial lights dead, the only illumination coming from a cluster of portable work lights set up in the center of the floor, the kind that construction crews used, casting a hard white circle in the darkness that made everything outside it harder to see. Inside the circle, 3 folding tables, equipment Claire couldn't immediately identify, and 2 men working at laptops with the focused urgency of people on a deadline. Caruso was at the far table. He was facing away from the door, visible only as a silhouette against the laptop screen's glow. But the posture was unmistakable. The particular set of his shoulders she had seen at her desk at 4:50 yesterday afternoon, when he had stood there and said that query flags and waited to see what she would do. The 2 other men registered the door opening before Caruso did. The closer one stood up fast, pushing back from the table, and his hand went to his waist, and Lorenzo said, "Don't," in a voice that was not loud but had a specific physical quality, the quality of a sound that fills the available space completely and leaves no room for anything else. And the man's hand stopped. The second man stood more slowly. Caruso turned around. In the hard white light of the work lamps, his face was the color of old plaster, and his eyes were doing something complex, moving from Lorenzo to Claire to the door behind them, and back to Lorenzo in a calculation that was visibly not producing good results. 12 years, Lorenzo said. Caruso said nothing. 12 years, Lorenzo said again. And the repetition was not for emphasis. It was something else. A man testing the weight of a number, turning it over, trying to make it resolve into something that made sense in the architecture of everything he thought he had known. "You were going to move on it in 3 weeks, Caruso said. His voice was flat, steadier than she expected. After the Zurich deal closed, the asset transfer would have been clean. It all would have moved through accounts that looked like legitimate proceeds from the deal. By the time anyone found the discrepancy, you'd have had a federal investigation already open against you and no way to close it." "And instead," Lorenzo said. "Instead, she found it in a day," Caruso said. He looked at Claire. She looked back at him and said nothing. "I told them she was a risk," Caruso said, "when you hired her. I ran her background. I flagged the Hargrove situation. She'd already demonstrated she wouldn't stay quiet when something was wrong. I told Farrow she was a variable." He paused. "Farrow said you wouldn't trust a secretary with anything that mattered." "Farrow was wrong," Lorenzo said. "Yes," Caruso said. "He was." Something in the room shifted. Not relaxed, tightened, the way a rope tightens when the weight on it changes. And the man near the closer table moved his hand again, and this time he was faster, and Lorenzo was already moving, and the next 4 seconds were the loudest and most compressed of Claire's life. The shot came from the second man, not the first. From the right side, from further back in the dark beyond the work lights, a position she hadn't accounted for and Lorenzo hadn't cleared. And the sound of it inside the corrugated steel building was enormous. A percussion that hit her in the chest like a shove, and Lorenzo went sideways, not down, sideways, behind the first folding table, which went over and took the laptop with it. And she dropped without deciding to drop, the animal part of her brain executing the command before the conscious part had formed the thought. Floor, cold concrete, the smell of old industrial lubricant and water. She was behind a steel support column, one of the building's vertical members, 12 inches wide, solid. She didn't remember getting there. She heard Lorenzo. Not a sound of pain, a sound of movement, of orientation, of someone repositioning in the dark beyond the tip table. She heard the second man reload. She heard Caruso say sharply to someone, Don't do that." She pressed her back against the column and made herself breathe. In, out. The iron pipe from the tunnel was still in her hand. She had been carrying it for 40 minutes without consciously registering it, and it was now the only thing between her and being entirely without options. She thought about the layout. The work lights were in the center. They were the problem. They lit the middle of the space and blinded anyone trying to see into the periphery. The second man was using that. He was in the dark, she was in the dark, Lorenzo was in the dark behind the tip table, and Caruso was standing inside the lit circle doing the math on a situation that had just deteriorated past whatever he'd intended. She looked at the work lights, 3 of them, on stands, powered by a cable running to a generator somewhere behind the cluster of tables. She looked at the generator. It was 8 feet from her column, in the open, 8 feet of open floor between her position and the generator, with the second man somewhere in the dark to her right and the first man last seen near the far table, and Caruso in the center doing something with his voice, saying stop, hold, wait, to someone who was not stopping or holding or waiting. 8 feet. She measured it. She heard Lorenzo move, a controlled sound, a repositioning, and she understood that he was drawing the attention in his direction, which was deliberate, which meant he knew approximately where she was, which meant he was giving her something. 8 feet. She went. Not fast enough to be loud, not slow enough to think about it. The midpoint between those two, the compressed sprint of someone who has committed and is no longer in conversation with fear about it. The concrete under her feet, the cold air, the white periphery of the work lights on her left. She hit the generator on her knees, found the power cable by touch in the dark behind it, and pulled. The lights went out. The darkness that replaced them was total and immediate and enormous. The absence of light in a large steel building with no windows is not like the dark of a room. It is the dark of a space that has no interest in accommodating human vision, and it fell on all of them with complete equality, and in the 3 seconds before anyone adjusted, Claire was already moving again. She went right, away from her previous position, away from the column. 3 steps, 4, finding the wall by the pressure of air changing against her face, and then the cold corrugated steel under her palm. She heard the second man. He was closer than she'd calculated. 4 feet, maybe less. She heard his breath, ragged, a man trying to control something that was getting away from him. And she heard the shift of his weight, and she dropped the pipe. Not by accident. The pipe hit the concrete with a sound that was loud and directional and completely wrong for where she was standing, and he went toward it, toward the sound, and she heard his footstep, and then she heard Lorenzo's voice from across the room. 1 word, in Italian, sharp as a blade. And then a sound of impact and a different kind of fall, the specific collapse of a person who has stopped collaborating with gravity. Silence. She pressed against the wall and did not move. "Claire," Lorenzo's voice, across the room, controlled. "Here," she said. A flashlight came on. His phone, the beam sweeping the floor. It found the second man down. It found the first man with his hands visible, which meant Victor had arrived, which meant the car service driver had either called someone or someone had been following them all along, and she would need to reconsider the entire timeline later. The beam moved to the center of the room. Caruso was still standing inside the circle where the work lights had been. He had not moved during any of it. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his face in the flashlight beam looking at Lorenzo with the expression of a man who had arrived at the end of a road he'd chosen for himself a long time ago and found that it ended here, in a decommissioned terminal in Red Hook, in the gray morning, with water on 3 sides and no version of forward left. Lorenzo walked toward him. Caruso watched him come. "The package went 20 minutes ago," Lorenzo said. "Everything. Federal disclosure. Your access logs, the wire trail, Pharaoh's apparatus." He stopped 4 feet from Caruso. It's done. Caruso exhaled. It was not surprise. It was recognition. You had it before this morning, Caruso said. I had enough, Lorenzo said. I needed to know where you'd go. Caruso looked at the floor, then he looked up. I wasn't going to let them hurt her, he said. The secretary. I told Faro she was off. Don't, Lorenzo said. Very quiet. Caruso closed his mouth. Don't tell me what you were and weren't going to allow, Lorenzo said. Don't stand in this room and tell me there were lines. He looked at him. 12 years, Marcus. I went to your daughter's confirmation. I stood in that hospital when your wife... He stopped. He looked at the corrugated wall. He looked back. You don't get to have lines. The silence between them was made of 12 years and the specific weight of the things that make a betrayal worse than simple treachery. The shared meals, the covered loyalties, the phone calls at 2 a.m. that you answer because it's that person and you answer because you trust them with the inside of what you are. Claire stood against the wall in the dark beyond the flashlight beam and watched this and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because this moment did not belong to her, and she understood that clearly enough to stay outside of it. Victor came through the personnel door with 2 men she recognized from the building's security rotation. He looked at the scene, at the men on the floor, at Caruso, at Lorenzo. The federal team is 8 minutes out, Victor said. 8 minutes. Lorenzo looked at Caruso for a long moment. Then he did something she had not predicted. He stepped back. He put his weapon away. He looked at Victor. When they arrive, you give them Caruso, and you give them the drive, and you give them everything Ricci prepared. He paused. Full cooperation. Everything they ask for. Victor absorbed this. And Faro. Faro is in the package, Lorenzo said. They'll move on him today. He looked at Caruso one more time. A long, finished look, the look of a man closing a door on something permanently. And then he turned away. He walked toward Claire. He stopped beside her in the dark beyond the flashlight beam and looked at her. His jacket was torn at the left shoulder where he'd gone sideways over the table. There was a cut above his eyebrow that was bleeding in the slow, persistent way of head wounds that aren't serious but aren't interested in stopping. His eyes were dark and very still, and he was breathing at the rate of someone who had been doing something physically demanding and had now stopped and was recalibrating. She looked at the cut. She looked at him. You're bleeding, she said. I'm aware, he said. You should have that. I know, he said. She held his gaze. Outside, beyond the corrugated steel walls, the harbor moved the way harbors move, indifferently, constantly, with the patience of something that has been here longer than any of the people or their problems, and will continue to be here after all of this has become historical record or has been forgotten entirely, which is the same thing from the harbor's perspective. 8 minutes, then federal agents, then documentation, then the long, grinding machinery of law and consequence and institutional record-keeping grinding into motion over everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. But right now, 8 minutes. The dark of the terminal, the smell of the harbor, a man with a cut above his eye who had made the choice she'd asked him to make, justice over fear, the law instead of the street, and was standing in the aftermath of that choice with the particular stillness of someone who has done the right thing and found that the right thing costs exactly as much as everyone says it does. She reached into her bag. She had a travel pack of tissues. She had had it since her first day because she was the kind of person who had a travel pack of tissues, and she pulled one out and held it toward him. He looked at it. He took it. He pressed it to the cut above his eye and held it there and looked at the floor and breathed, and she stood beside him in the dark of the terminal with the sound of the harbor outside and the federal team 4 minutes out now, and she thought about the question he'd asked her at the beginning of all of this, not the question she'd expected, not the one she'd dreaded, but the real question underneath it. The one he'd been asking since the morning she'd sat across from him for an interview that was not an interview. And she thought about what it meant that she was still here, still standing, still choosing the same direction. The personnel door opened, light flooded in, and everything that came next began. The federal agents came in with the particular organized energy of people who had been waiting for this moment longer than the people inside the building had known they were waiting. 6 of them. Plain clothes, badges on lanyards, one woman in the lead with short brown hair, and the compressed authority of someone who had learned to take up exactly the right amount of space in any room. Not too much, not too little, precisely the amount required to make everything in the room reorganize itself around her presence without being asked. Special Agent Dana Reyes. She came through the personnel door and took in the scene in one sweep. The 2 men on the floor, Victor and his team, Caruso standing in the center with his hands visible, Lorenzo against the wall with the tissue pressed to his eyebrow, and Claire beside him with concrete dust on her knees and an iron pipe on the floor 6 feet away that she was not going to explain unless directly asked. And her face did the specific thing that experienced federal agents' faces do when they arrive at a scene that is worse than the briefing and better than the worst case, which is nothing. Her face did nothing. She filed everything and moved. "Mr. Bellucci," she said. "Agent Reyes," Lorenzo said. "You're bleeding." "I've been informed," he said. She looked at Claire. "Executive Secretary," Claire said. Reyes looked at her for a moment longer than seemed necessary, and then looked back at Lorenzo. "We'll need statements from everyone, separately." She looked at Caruso. "Mr. Caruso, you're going to want to cooperate fully starting right now because the window for that being worth anything is closing, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to use it while it still exists." Caruso looked at Lorenzo. Lorenzo did not look at him. Caruso looked at the floor and said, "I'll cooperate." Reyes nodded once, and 2 of her team moved toward Caruso with the smooth efficiency of people executing a practice sequence, and Claire watched Caruso put his hands behind his back and watched the cuffs go on, and watched him walk toward the door with his shoulders carrying something enormous and invisible and permanent. And she thought about 12 years in a hospital and a daughter's confirmation and the specific human catastrophe of someone who had made a choice so long ago that they'd had time to build an entire architecture of justification around it and live inside that architecture for years until the morning it fell. She did not feel sorry for him. She felt the weight of it, which was different. The statements took 4 hours. They did Claire's first, in the back of a federal vehicle parked on Imlay Street with the harbor visible through the window and a recorder on the seat between her and a young agent named Paulson, who wrote everything down even though the recorder was running, which she understood as a redundancy built into the procedure rather than any distrust of technology. She told it in sequence. All of it. The routing number. Vantero. The photograph. The conversation on 39. Caruso at her desk. The text message before the explosion. The tunnels. Red Hook. She told it without editorializing and without omitting anything except the specific language Lorenzo had used in Italian on the phone because she hadn't caught all of it, and she would not guess. Paulson asked her at one point, "When did you first understand that the Bellucci Group was not operating as a purely legitimate holding company?" She looked at him. She thought about what she knew and what she could prove and what the difference between those two things cost. "My role," she said, "was executive secretary. I managed schedules, documentation, and internal communications. In that capacity, I identified a financial discrepancy that I reported through the appropriate internal channel." She paused. "I don't have personal knowledge of the company's operational structure beyond what was required for my position." Paulson wrote something down. Reyes, who had been standing outside the vehicle the entire time and who Claire had not known was listening, opened the door and leaned in. "Ms. Whitmore," she said. "Agent Reyes." That was a very well-constructed answer. It was an accurate answer, Claire said. Reyes looked at her with the particular expression of someone deciding whether to push on something and deciding not to. "At least not today. At least not here." "You'll be available for follow-up." "Of course," Claire said. Reyes closed the door. Claire looked at the harbor. Mamat. Lorenzo's statement took longer. She waited on a low concrete barrier at the edge of the access road and watched the activity at the terminal. Agents in and out, equipment being removed, a forensic team arriving in a second vehicle. And she drank a coffee that Victor had produced from somewhere without explanation and which she did not question. The blister on her left heel had progressed from acute pain to a dull systemic ache that had spread up through her ankle and settled there as a permanent condition of her mourning. Her left knee, where she had fallen in the tunnel, had stiffened in the cold air and was communicating its unhappiness with every movement. She sat on the concrete barrier and drank bad coffee and watched the harbor and felt underneath everything the specific bone-deep exhaustion of a body that had been running on adrenaline and stubbornness for approximately 12 hours and had now been informed that the emergency was over and was beginning, cautiously, to put down the weight. Victor came and stood beside her at some point. He didn't sit. "Pharaoh," she said. "Arrested at his offices in Midtown," Victor said. 40 minutes ago. Federal warrant." A pause. There were 2 other companies in the apparatus. Same method, same wire structure. One in Chicago, one in Miami. He paused again. "We were the 3rd. She absorbed this. "The 18 million, she said. "Recovered," Victor said. "The Cayman accounts were frozen as part of the disclosure package." Ricci confirmed the authorization trail. He looked at the terminal. "Clean recovery, which almost never happens." She nodded. They stood in silence for a while. "The text message," she said. "Before the explosion. Unknown number." Victor was quiet for a moment. "That was me," he said. She looked at him. "I had been monitoring Caruso's secondary communications for 6 days," he said. "When I saw the trigger sequence at 11:47, the system wipe, I knew the street action was coming. I didn't have time to go through Lorenzo. I had your personal number from the emergency contact form you filed your first week." He paused. "I considered it an appropriate use." She looked at him for a long moment. "You could have led with that," she said. "Yes," he said. "I could have." He went back to the terminal. She finished her coffee. Lorenzo came out at 11:40. He had a white bandage above his left eyebrow where someone, a federal medic or Victor, she didn't know, had closed the cut. His jacket was still torn at the shoulder. He looked like a man who had been awake for a long time and had no immediate plans to address that. And he walked to where she was sitting on the concrete barrier with the directness of someone who knows exactly where they're going and has stopped performing anything about it. He sat beside her, not close, a normal distance. 2 people sitting on a concrete barrier at the edge of an access road in Red Hook, with the harbor in front of them and Manhattan across the water and the November gray overhead doing what November gray does, which is commit completely to itself and leave no room for anything warmer. He didn't speak for a while. She didn't either. The harbor moved. A container ship in the middle distance was making its way toward the upper bay with the patient, in different progress of something too large to be hurried by anything as local as human urgency. "Caruso's deal," Lorenzo said finally. "Full cooperation," she said. "They'll use him to build the case on Pharaoh's other operations, Chicago and Miami." "I know," he said. "That bothers you." He looked at the water. "A man who spent 12 years inside my organization walks out with a reduced sentence because he's useful." He paused. "Yes, it bothers me." "It's the right outcome," she said. "It's the practical outcome," he said. "Those aren't always the same thing." She thought about that, about the space between right and practical and all the compromises that lived there. "You let him walk out with cuffs instead of—" She stopped. "Instead of the alternative," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You told me to. In the terminal. The whole architecture of what you built last night. The SAR package, the federal disclosure. That was you telling me what the outcome needed to be." "I gave you options," she said. "You made the choice. You gave me one real option," he said, "and you knew I'd take it." She looked at him. He looked at the water. "Did I?" she said. "You understood something about me," he said, "before I understood it about myself, which is either very impressive or very presumptuous." "Probably both," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, gone before it completed. They sat in the quiet of the harbor for a while. She thought about the morning of her first day, the elevator and the leather smell and the floor numbers climbing. The office. The interview that wasn't an interview. The man who had turned from the window and looked at her in one efficient sweep and told her to sit. And she had sat, and the entire rest of this had followed from that single moment in the way that everything follows from the thing that changes the direction of everything. "The Meridian building," she said. "Is it—" "Cleared," he said. "Reyes's team swept it. The 3 men who came in through the loading dock are in federal custody. The others on 57th. He stopped. One got out. They'll find him. She nodded. The structural damage, he said, meaning the building. The ceiling on 39. The lobby glass. Cosmetic. 2 weeks. Good, she said. Another silence. You'll need to decide, he said, what you want to happen next. She looked at him. With the job. With the job, he said. With the clearance on 39. He paused. With the fact that you are now a named witness in a federal investigation into organized financial crime, which is a thing that follows a person. She had thought about this in the vehicle during her statement. She had thought about it carefully and arrived at the place she always arrived when she thought carefully about difficult things, which was the place where the answer was already there and had been there the whole time, and the thinking was just the process of getting honest about it. I'm aware of what it follows me with, she said. You could take a different position, he said. Somewhere that's quieter, she said. Yes. She looked at the container ship, almost past the point of visibility now, making its patient way toward whatever came next. I had a quiet position before this one, she said, at Hargrove. I built a compliance restructure from the ground up, and my supervisor put his name on it, and HR told me the company preferred to resolve things quietly. She paused. Quiet wasn't working for me. Lorenzo looked at her. Besides, she said, you still don't have a functioning chief of security, or a complete accounting staff, or for that matter, an annex on 39 that isn't compromised. She looked at him. Your organizational situation is a disaster. He said nothing. Your scheduling alone, she said, is going to take a week to rebuild from the ground up. Miss Whitmore, I'm just saying the practical case for retaining me is quite strong. The corner of his mouth moved again, and this time it went further and stayed longer, and for a moment she saw the thing that lived underneath all of it, underneath the tailored jacket and the shoulder holster and the 12 years of building an empire and the specific exhausted grief of a man who had just finished dismantling a piece of himself that had been named Caruso, the actual face of a man who was, under everything, capable of finding something funny about the situation he was in, which meant he was not entirely broken, which was the most important piece of information she had gathered in 4 weeks of gathering information. I'll have Daniel contact you about the terms, he said. Daniel doesn't know about 39, she said. Daniel will have revised clearance by Monday, he said. She nodded. They sat with that for a moment. Then Lorenzo stood. He straightened his torn jacket, the automatic gesture, the exterior recalibrated, and looked at the harbor one more time. The car is on Imlay, he said. She stood. Her knee protested and her heel protested, and she absorbed both protests without visible response and fell in beside him as they walked back up the access road toward the street. The weeks that followed were not quiet. The federal case moved with the speed of an investigation that had been building infrastructure for 4 years before the door opened, which is to say, it moved faster than anyone had expected and slower than everyone wanted, which is the nature of all federal cases, and which produced a particular grinding daily texture of depositions, document requests, supplemental disclosures, and phone calls with lawyers that Claire handled with the same organized thoroughness she brought to everything, because the Bellucci Group's legal team needed someone who could manage the logistical architecture of a multi-party federal cooperation agreement while simultaneously keeping the operational side of the company from falling apart. And that turned out to be exactly the kind of problem she was built for. Farrow was indicted on 14 counts in the second week. His operations in Chicago and Miami unraveled in sequence, pulled apart by the thread that Caruso provided, and the apparatus he'd spent 4 years building. The shells, the rerouted identifiers, the forged authorizations, the entire patient architecture of financial infiltration, came down with the particular totality of structures that had been designed to look permanent, but were in fact dependent on one central load-bearing element, and when that element was removed, the rest had nothing to hold it up. Caruso pled. His agreement was sealed, which meant Claire never saw the terms, which was fine. She had no interest in the terms. She had interest in the outcome, which was a working organization and a cleared financial record, and Pharaoh in a federal courtroom answering for 4 years of systematic predation against companies that had trusted their own internal people. She filed the federal disclosures and she rebuilt the scheduling system, and she found Lorenzo a new head of security, a woman named Torres who came from a federal contractor background and had the specific quality of someone who had spent years working for people whose operational security needs were not hypothetical, which meant she and Lorenzo established an understanding in their first meeting that took most people months to reach. She did not rebuild Caruso's role herself. That was not her job. But she organized the transition documentation, cataloged the access architecture, identified 3 critical vulnerabilities in the secondary server's permission structure that Caruso had built into it years ago. Not as sabotage, she thought, just as a man keeping doors open for himself that he hadn't decided to use yet, and had Torres close all 3 before the end of the second week. Ricci she saw daily. He was diminished by what had happened, not in competence, which was intact, but in some quality of ease he'd carried before, a comfort in his own position that had been stripped down to something more careful and more watchful. He did his job well. He did it with the thoroughness of a man who understood that his continued presence in the building was a courtesy extended on the basis of performance, and he was not wrong about that, and he seemed to have made peace with knowing it. She did not ask him about the 9 years, about what it had been like to have his credentials forged, his name placed on documents he hadn't touched, his reputation quietly used as the frame for someone else's plan. She didn't ask because she didn't need to ask. She had sat in the room when he described it, and she had heard the specific flatness of a man recounting something that had already cost him more than the words could carry. Some things you don't ask about, you let them be what they are. 6 weeks after Red Hook, Lorenzo called her into the office at 6:50 in the morning, which was slightly earlier than usual, and when she came in he was at his desk rather than the window, which was also slightly unusual, and he had 2 espressos on the desk instead of 1. She sat down. He looked at the espresso nearest her. She picked it up. "The restructuring plan," he said. "I have the draft," she said. "The board meeting is Thursday." "The board meeting," he said, "is going to be difficult." "I've prepared for difficult," she said. He looked at her. 4 of the 7 board members were aware, at some level, that the company's historical structure included non-standard revenue channels. She absorbed this. Non-standard revenue channels. She looked at her espresso. She thought about what she knew and what she could prove and what she was being told right now, which was something she had suspected for 4 weeks and had been waiting to be confirmed or denied, and was now being confirmed in the careful language of a man who had decided she had earned the unguarded version. "How non-standard?" she said. He looked at the desk. "Historical," he said. "The structure has been converting for 3 years. The Zurich deal that Pharaoh was targeting, the legitimate proceeds I mentioned in the car, that was the last major conversion. After Thursday, the board's composition changes, and the remaining structure is clean." He paused. "I need the restructuring plan to be airtight, not just legally, structurally, in a way that doesn't leave room for anyone to find a thread 3 years from now and pull it." She held the espresso in both hands. She thought about the woman at the agency with the reading glasses on a chain who had sat across from her and said, "Mr." Bellucci expects problems to be solved before he identifies them. She thought about the elevator and the floor numbers climbing and the office and the interview that wasn't an interview and the shoulder holster and the matte black phone and the tunnel under 57th Street and the iron pipe on the floor of a terminal in Red Hook. She thought about what she had known all along and chosen to work with because the work was real and the problem was real, and the man across the desk was in the process of becoming something different from what he had been. And she had decided, early, quietly, without making a performance of it, that the process of becoming was worth more than the history it was moving away from. "The plan is airtight," she said. "I'll walk the board through it section by section on Thursday. Anyone who tries to find a thread won't find one." He looked at her. "You've known," he said, "for longer than 6 weeks. I've suspected," she said, "for approximately 3.5 weeks. And?" She set the espresso down. She looked at him across the clean desk with the legal pad and the pen and the half-empty glass of water and the map of southern Italy behind him with its handwritten annotations that she had still never been close enough to read. "I've watched you make 4 decisions in the last 6 weeks," she said. any one of which could have gone a different direction. The SAR package instead of the alternative, full federal cooperation. Torres instead of someone from the old structure. The board restructure. She paused. The pattern is clear. The pattern could be practical, he said, not principled. It could be, she said. I've considered that. And? The pattern is too consistent to be purely practical, she said. Practical would have included at least one exception by now. You haven't made an exception. He looked at her for a long moment. You're very certain about things, he said. I'm certain about sequences, she said. Sequences don't lie the way individual events can. Something shifted in his face. It was small and happened quickly, and was not the shape of a smile or the shape of the assessment she'd been on the receiving end of since the first morning, but something else. Something that didn't have a clean professional name and therefore existed only in the way faces carry things that can't be said. He looked at the legal pad. Thursday, he said. Thursday, she said. She picked up the espresso and finished it and stood and went back to her desk. And the morning began with the particular organized energy of a day that had real work in it, which was the only kind of morning she had ever wanted. The board meeting on Thursday ran 4 hours. It was, as Lorenzo had predicted, difficult. 2 members pushed back on the restructuring timeline. One, a man named Ashworth, who had been on the board since before Lorenzo took the American division, made the specific mistake of suggesting, in the language of careful implication, that certain historical arrangements had been mutually beneficial and that a complete restructuring might be premature. Claire was sitting at the end of the conference table with her documentation and her notepad, and she looked at Ashworth and said, in a voice that was completely level and completely without apology, "The federal disclosure filed 6 weeks ago is a matter of record. Any board member whose personal financial interests intersect with the company's pre-restructuring arrangements is advised to consult independent counsel before this meeting concludes. I can provide a list of appropriate firms if that would be helpful." The room was very quiet. Ashworth looked at Lorenzo. Lorenzo looked at the table. Ashworth did not speak again for the remainder of the meeting. The restructuring plan passed 5-2. The 2 dissenting votes were logged and noted, and their implications were clear to everyone in the room, including the 2 people who had cast them. Claire packed her documentation after the meeting and walked back to her desk and sat down and took a long breath. In, out, the specific exhale of something completed, and then opened the next item in the queue because the queue did not pause for completions, which was something she had always found oddly comforting about the nature of work. Daniel appeared at her station in the mid-afternoon. "He'd like you in the office," Daniel said. She went in. Lorenzo was at the window. She had been in this office many times now, in many different configurations of what that meant, and she stood in it with the late afternoon light coming through the glass and the Manhattan skyline doing what it did at this hour, which was organize itself into something that looked intentional, and she waited. "Ashworth resigned this morning," he said. "I saw the email," she said. "The second dissenting vote, Morrow, called legal this afternoon. His counsel is advising full compliance with the restructuring terms." "Good," she said. He turned from the window. He looked at her. Not the assessment, not the flat efficient survey, but the thing she'd been seeing more of in 6 weeks, the thing that didn't have a clean name. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person they have stopped calculating and started simply seeing. "I want to restructure your role," he said. She waited. "The title of executive secretary," he said, "is not accurate for what you've been doing. It hasn't been accurate since approximately your 2nd week." "The title doesn't matter to me," she said. "It matters to me," he said, "because what you do matters to what this company is, and I'd prefer the structure to reflect that." She looked at him. "Director of Internal Operations," he said. "You oversee document security, internal compliance, and coordination between legal, security, and finance. You have direct report access to me and parallel authority with department heads in matters of internal process." He paused. "The compensation adjustment is significant." She was quiet for a moment. "The clearance on 39, she said. "Full," he said. "Torres reports to you," she said, "not through me. I won't have operational security in my direct chain. There's a conflict of interest risk there that the federal agreement—" "I know," he said. "Torres remains separate. You coordinate, you don't command. She nodded slowly. The terms, she said, should be reviewed by independent counsel before I sign. Obviously, he said, and I want a written protocol for what happens if I identify something I'm required to disclose federally that you'd prefer to handle internally first. He looked at her. We need a procedure, she said, in writing. One that protects both of us and is consistent with the cooperation agreement. I won't operate without it. He was quiet for a moment. You're negotiating, he said. I'm establishing ground rules, she said. There's a difference. The corner of his mouth moved. I'll have legal draft it, he said. You'll review it. I'll revise it, she said. You'll revise it, he agreed. She stood in the late afternoon light with the city behind him and the agreement between them and the specific settled feeling of something finding the shape it had always been moving toward. And she thought about the first morning, the elevator, the blister, the portfolio pressed against her ribs like a shield, and how far that morning was from this one, and how straight the line was between them if you knew where to look. Is there anything else? She said. He looked at her. That morning, he said. The question I asked you. She met his eyes. You froze, he said, for about 2 seconds, which was the only time in 4 months I've seen you freeze. I was recalibrating, she said. I know, he said. That's what I'm talking about. She held his gaze. You recalibrated, he said, and then you held your ground. In a room you'd been in for 4 weeks with a man you had every reason to be afraid of, and you held your ground and told me the truth. She said nothing. I hadn't had that in a long time, he said. Someone willing to hold their ground. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the city was going amber in the late light. That specific hour when the glass towers caught it and turned and the whole skyline became something that looked too beautiful to be real, which was what New York did at this hour, every day, regardless of what was happening inside any of its buildings. You should probably have said that to someone who didn't work for you, she said. Probably, he said. There are protocols, she said. I'm aware of the protocols, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The city held its amber light for another moment and then began slowly its evening conversion into something else. Thursday's board minutes need to be finalized, she said. They do, he said. And Ricci needs the Q4 projections reviewed before the end of the week. He does, he said. She nodded once. She turned toward the door. Miss Whitmore. She stopped. She didn't turn all the way around. She half turned, enough to see his face in her peripheral vision, the bandage gone now from above his eye, and the cut sealed and the scar it would leave already beginning to form, a thin line through the left eyebrow that would be visible for the rest of his life. The blister, he said. Your left heel, your second week. You were favoring it. She looked at him. I noticed, he said. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place and you clearly didn't want it said. But I noticed. She was quiet for a moment. It healed, she said. I know, he said. She turned back toward the door. She went to her desk and sat down and opened the board minutes file and began the finalization, and the office behind her was quiet, and the city outside was doing its evening thing, and the building was clean and intact and running, and the queue was long, and the work was real, and that was enough. That was, she had learned in 4 months of learning things the hard way, more than enough. Outside on 57th Street, the traffic moved, and the pedestrians moved, and the city went on being exactly itself. Enormous, indifferent, demanding, and in its way completely honest about all 3 of those things. And 40 floors above it, in an office with a map of southern Italy on the wall and a legal pad on the desk and 2 people who had each survived things that had tried very hard to be unsurvivable, the work continued, as it always does, as it always would.